Hello, welcome to this special panel discussion discussing the opportunities for British retail in the ASEAN markets. My name is McGarrigle. I'm the chairman of the World Retail Congress and chairman of the Retail Congress Asia Pacific, which was held recently in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and was supported by the Department for International Trade, who are supporting this video discussion. And delighted to have with me two panellists here in the studio and one coming in from Kuala Lumpur. Representing the Department for International Trade, I'm delighted to have Fred Bassnett, who is the Retail and Consumer Sector Specialist. And to my left, Lee Braid, who is the International Franchise Director for M&Co, or Mackays Stores Limited, as it's also known. And joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Andy Jackson, who's the MD of Debenhams, Malaysia. So welcome to you, Andy, and welcome to you both. What we're going to be discussing for the next 50 or so minutes is, as I say, the opportunities for UK retailers in the ASEAN markets. And the reasons really speak for themselves. What we're talking about is an enormous and very exciting area. Its ASEAN region is made up of 10 countries, including such dynamos as Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines and Vietnam, as well as others. It represents 650 million people, growth rates on average of around 10%. And one of the fantastic statistics about the Asian region is if it was a country, it would be the 7th largest in the world. And at the current pace of economic growth will be the 4th largest economy in the world by 2050. Its number of households is set to double from today's 67 million to 125 million by 2025. And one of the key things that strikes you when you visit the region is the young demographic, how young the country is. The average age is very young, and that's also adding to the fact that it has one of the fastest growing middle classes in the world. And just to sort of reinforce the dynamism of the region, and the thing that was really most striking about our recent Retail Congress Asia Pacific Congress in Malaysia is the focus, and quite rightly so, on the speed of development of e-commerce, not just modern retailing, but e-commerce within that, and that's been driven by some incredible figures in terms of smartphone adoption. And all of these factors, I think, quite rightly put the ASEAN region on the map, and an increasing number of UK retailers are already looking at the region, are already trading very successfully in the region. And our task is to discuss more about the region, what it means for UK retail, and to look really specifically at the opportunities and how UK retailers can go about establishing a business in the region. And I've already introduced the panel, but I'd really like each of the panellists to maybe sort of introduce themselves a little bit more and say what you do and a bit about the business and kind of the experience you have of the Asian region. But really, if I'd like to turn to you first, Fred, if you could sort of say a little bit more about your work with the DIT and some opening thoughts on the region.
Okay, thanks, Ian. First of all, I am Fred Bassnett. I am the Senior Retail Sector Specialist at the Department for International Trade. I've been in the role for approximately 5 years when we formed the retail team. So I feel like I'm the old stager in the team. Those days there were 3 of us. The team grew to 47 in strength, and it just shows the commitment that the HM government has towards the retail sector. During the last 5 years, I've made a lot of new friends, and I've come across an awful lot of people that I've either worked with, worked for, or they've worked for me. So having spent 35 years in the private sector with companies such as Debenhams, House of Fraser, Furniture Village Group and Alders International, where those days we were the 2nd largest duty tax-free operator in the world. It's been nice in recent years to revisit some of the territories that I knew 20 years ago and to have seen the phenomenal changes. So, yeah, delighted to be here, Ian, and I was delighted to be in Kuala Lumpur at World Retail Congress, as I'd not been in Kuala Lumpur for some 18 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Lee.
Thanks, Ian. My name's Lee Braid, and I'm the International Franchise Director for M&Co. We are the fashion retail arm of Mackays Stores Limited. In the UK, we've got just over 270 stores. We're a family fashion business focused primarily on women's, kids and menswear, although we do also trade home. My main responsibility is to develop the international business, grow those partnerships and develop our network of stores. To date, we've opened in 10 countries, 28 stores, so possibly compared to a few other UK retailers, a little bit early still in our development, but certainly moving forward pretty quickly. The business itself is really looking to push on. We're going to open 20 stores this season across our UK and international network, really giving us a chance to take that next step and really develop the business. To date, our focus has been more in the traditional franchise markets, if I can use that phrase, around the Middle East and some of the European markets. And I think the ASEAN region really gives us an opportunity to broaden our horizons, take the next step and really develop some of those other international partnerships.
And where did you start internationalising the business?
Well, our first store actually opened in Dubai, which I guess is where a number of UK retailers have actually started. We opened our first store in Dubai, but very quickly expanded into all 6 GCC countries. And then, as I say, we've now developed into certain European markets. We've opened in Pakistan. We even have stores in Libya. So the business is pretty democratic, and the key challenge for us is really finding the franchise partner that we can work with in the market. I think we're pretty confident that we've got a range and a proposition that fits well into most market situations, but for us, given our model, it's really finding that local partner that we can work with and really develop the business together.
Yeah, thank you. Turning to you, Andy, if you could introduce yourself and a little bit about the business that Devlins has in Malaysia.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Yes, I've been working here in Malaysia on the retail side for the past 13 years. The company, Stellar Retail, we brought in Early Learning Centre franchise business in 2003, and we developed that business into 5 standalone stores within Kuala Lumpur, which has the predominant, the large city-based population. I mean, we have 7 million people in KL. There's about 30 million people in throughout Malaysia. But in terms of the sort of people that we are trying to attract as customers, they are essentially KL customer base. So we were in a number of the sort of key malls that we needed to be in during those 5 years or so. We had that business. And then we turned our focus about 8 years ago to the Debenhams business model. We developed contacts with the international team there, and we have since, in the past 8 years, we've now developed the business here in Malaysia to 3 stores, 2 stores in KL and 1 in Penang. We're trading on upwards of 70,000 square feet currently with about 100 staff. I think it's very interesting to have this opportunity to talk to you all on this sort of idea, the premise of British brands getting involved. I mean, it's nothing new. There are a lot of brands here that have been here for some time. We've got the likes of Topshop, Miss Selfridge, Dorothy Perkins, Tesco. Next just came in quite recently. Hamleys came in quite recently as well. And I think that there's still plenty of room for more British brands to get onto that bandwagon. I don't think that it's ever too late. But there are, I'm sure we'll discuss during the course of this conversation, there are certain particular challenges we're facing right now, currently in Malaysia and Singapore in particular, which I think brands should be aware of and take into account in their general strategy for a Southeast Asian or ASEAN approach. And I think in the same way brands should have, and I'm sure Lee's touched on this himself about getting into the Middle East market. You have to have a Middle East strategy. You've got to have a China strategy, an India strategy. It's very important that any approach to this particular regional market factors in, for example, I think Australasia, rather than just saying we should concentrate on ASEAN as a potential market. There's so many disparate types of problems with Indonesia, for example, has certain peculiarities. Singapore and Malaysia have different things going on. Thailand has issues as well. So I think it's quite important to take an overall approach to this market in particular.
As I mentioned, we worked very closely with the Department for International Trade, who supported us at our recent Retail Congress Asia Pacific, which took place in Kuala Lumpur. And it was a fascinating 2 days of some great speakers and discussions. And sort of picking up on Andy's point, I think a key thing to say is across the Asia-Pacific region and Southeast Asia, yes, there are economic challenges. We heard a lot about that. There's been a slowdown in those economic growth rates. I think if you compare it with sort of Western European economies or North American economies, you would say that's still a healthy growth rate, but it is still a step change in what's been the common experience there. But what was really striking, and I alluded to it earlier, is the fundamentals of the region, in ASEAN region and beyond. A lot of it is driven by the demographic changes. It's a very young region, and the population growth is leading to. We heard from a leading economist from Planet Retail that just through the population growth alone over the next 5 years, the retail sales, the consumer economy will grow by 3.26 trillion US dollars, which certainly struck me and struck a number of people who heard that. And I think with that such young markets, it's inescapable the importance of e-commerce and mobile commerce within that. We heard from the head of Google and in Asia that 3.8 million people are coming online every month, and 40% of the Asian population are now hyper-connected, and you can just imagine what that means for e-commerce, but also retailing. But that's not to detract, and I think we heard a lot also at the Congress about the importance of the shopping malls and modern retail space. And unlike what we're experiencing in Western economies, it's not slowing down. New retail space coming on, and certainly in Malaysia there's new shopping malls being planned and opened, and certainly across the Asian region. So I think there's a really important sort of context that we heard within the Congress. So really wanted to now sort of bring in our panellists and sort of taking all of those key points, keen to get some views on how all three of you would see the current opportunities within the ASEAN region. And Andy, you alluded to that in terms of the differences within different markets. But maybe Fred, if I can turn to you first, thinking about UK businesses, UK retailers, how would you describe the current opportunities for UK businesses looking at the ASEAN region?
Well, Ian, I suppose it's only been the last 3 or 4 years that I've revisited the ASEAN region, and I can recall being about 18 months ago in Indonesia, for instance. And if I ask the average person in the UK, what can you tell me about Indonesia, I normally get Bali mentioned, and it's a resort area. And then when you actually look at the country, you've got a population in excess of 200, probably 230 million people in a place like Indonesia. It's hard to imagine. And if you look at cities like Jakarta and then the second and third, fourth largest cities, you actually are hitting a population of probably across 5 cities in Indonesia, close on 120 million people. And it's really difficult to sometimes put into perspective. And I was talking to an executive from L'Oreal, the cosmetic giant, and they were actually building, at that point it's now open, the largest manufacturing plant in the world, and they were putting it in Indonesia. So I thought, well, I'll dig a bit deeper, and you're absolutely right. The population, it's a younger population. 32% of the population are classed or termed as middle class, and Indonesia in the next 5 years is likely to be the 7th largest economy in the world. And it sort of brings it home very quickly that these markets. So I started to look at Vietnam, and I started to look at Thailand, and suddenly my whole perspective of these markets has changed. As you said, it's a younger population. They are very tech savvy. And again, if you look at the numbers, the United Kingdom, the United States and parts of Europe are fairly sophisticated in terms of our e-commerce in retail. You know, maybe 15, 16, 17% of our retail businesses are done online. In these markets at this moment in time, we're talking about single-digit figures. So we can already see that these markets will replicate what we have in Europe and, say, North America. And therefore, from my perspective, the ASEAN region is probably the region that I would be targeting if I was a UK retailer.
And are you seeing an increase in sort of representations from UK retailers who are looking to expand internationally?
Oh, absolutely.
Are they saying this is where we want to look?
Absolutely, and Lee would be an example of that, because Lee came out with
yes,
the Department of International Trade delegation. And I think, Lee, I think you were somewhat surprised at the actual opportunities that exist and the number of people that you met that potentially could be partners. And, you know, it's all about, as you said, finding the right partner, but shaping your model, because the model does have to be different for almost any country that you actually go in. There are always tweaks that are needed. And Andy, in particular, you would know that from operating in Malaysia. The models always have to be tweaked to suit the local culture and clientele.
Thanks, Fred. So picking up on Fred's point, you did join us, Lee, at the Congress. So yes. I don't know if that was your first visit to the region, but we'd be really interested to get your thoughts on how you see the opportunities in the Asia and the ASEAN region in particular.
I think for us, we are particularly starting to take a look at Malaysia. If then for no other reason than we see it as a good gateway into that whole market. I think although we cluster all the countries under the ASEAN region, I think as Andy's already touched on, there's a number of differences between them, although they're perhaps under some common treaties, but actually when you're trading and dealing with them, there are a number of intricacies that we would need to deal with. But I think we're more confident about entering into a market like Malaysia, given that other UK retailers have already developed there. That certainly shows us that there's appetite for UK business, and really from our point of view, it's going to be competing with those UK brands, but also a number of other international and indeed very strong local brands that we would need to compete with. I think it's interesting that Fred was talking there about flexibility in the model, and I think when we have started on our franchise journey, it's been quite a regimented bricks and mortar view, quite a regimented model as well, but we're starting to, now that we've got more infrastructure in our business, we're able to offer more flexibility. We're talking to partners in some markets about e-com only solutions. You know, once we've taken a look at the market ourselves, and if a bricks and mortar store locations aren't necessarily viable, then again we've got enough infrastructure now and flexibility to be able to look at different ways of actually doing business in some of these countries. But I think it's also a region you just can't ignore. You know, you can't ignore 7th biggest economy, 30% middle class. The growth rates, despite slowing down, are still very strong. And I think the key thing is that burgeoning population that's coming through. People are hungry for international goods, and I think in that sense that gives us a real opportunity.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. So, Andy, if I can bring you in, because you've obviously got the advantage, you've been in Malaysia and the region for a few years, as you said in your introduction. Be really interested to get your perspective on what you see as the opportunities for UK retail in Malaysia, but beyond, and maybe talk about the, you know, we read a lot about the slowdown, and you know that seems to be a shock to the system, but really, what does that actually mean? How does it manifest itself as you experience it?
Pick up on Fred's point about the importance of brands coming to, you know, they've not been in this market before, or Asia before, you know, making sure that they think carefully about whether the model, you know, it's very easy, I think, to some principals, not just the UK, but anywhere, America or any part of Europe in particular, to think we want to export our model as is. That's, you know, we've got a very successful business, and it's very important that we police our model, if you'd like to use that terminology, to make sure that, you know, it works sort of one cookie cutter type thing fits all. And I think Fred's right. I think, you know, every market is different, and especially in Asia, There are so many different types of holidays in Malaysia alone. I mean, I lose count. We just had Deepavali, then we have Hari Raya, and Christmas is just around the corner, then Chinese New Year. So, it's just a constant smorgasbord of festivities, and which you just don't have in the UK, for example, the same one. So it is important, I think, for principals to think, okay, we've got our principal hat on, but if we're going to tie up with a partner, a local partner, what are we doing that for? Is it purely to reduce our risk ourselves? And the financial involvement, of course, is number one. But I think it's also because maybe subconsciously they think that, well, they should be thinking, I think, that they know the market better than perhaps we do. We have a very British perspective of the business, and so it's wise to have perhaps someone who does know something more about the regional, local market to be involved with our business. So I think that takes a little bit of getting used to that idea of, okay, well, yes, we want to have our proven business model adapted or into the markets the best way possible. You don't want to lose sight, of course, of the basic fundamentals of a proven business, but you do, I think, need to take on board perhaps that there will be some requirements, more likely than not, to make sure that it can be adapted to the local market. I think a key case in point here, and I don't suppose we're able to name brands, but it's been one of my bugbears for many years. And I thought they'd got to grips with it this year, but clearly they haven't, because their window displays here in KL have still got the same things up as they've had for the past 3 or 4 years. It's a fast fashion Japanese chain. No guesses. I mean, it's the biggest one there is. Okay, but right now, if you go down to their flagship store in KL, as for the past 3 or 4 years, I've said, the window display has a series of mannequins, and they've got winter jackets on, earmuffs, scarves, and hats. And we're talking a climate, as you gentlemen are aware, you were here not that long ago, which is generally 32 degrees and very humid and tropical. And they haven't quite grasped the need, I think, to make sure that they have a better, that whole 3 or 4 month period at the end of the year. I know why they're doing it. It's the same with a number of American fashion chains, leading ones that have done the same thing coming to this region. They have not been able successfully yet to actually cater in the same way Devlins has, for example, to make sure that all the product all year round, 360 plus days of the year, is suitable for the local market. If you're not doing that from the get-go, you're putting at any partner that you might tie up with at a distinct disadvantage. And I don't think you're doing your brand any good in the medium to long term, because, essentially, why would a Malaysian or a number of Malaysians, you might get the odd one who's going back to, study in the UK or something, who wants to buy a bomber jacket or something, sure. But is there really enough business to justify having your partners tie up with this amount of stock for this length of time at this particular time of the year? So I think that is important. I think Fred's right that, come to the market by all means. There's plenty of possibilities here. But the first question should really be, have I got the right product? What is it I'm trying to sell? And, is it suitable for the population that I'm trying to sell to? And then I think the point that Lee said, that the importance of having product, an affinity in a market for the product you're trying to sell, and I think that's exactly ties in with this. I think that's why Malaysia is potentially a very good avenue into the region. Historically, it might have been through Hong Kong or potentially Singapore, but the cost of doing business there is so high these days that actually Malaysia is, I think, becoming a better springboard for a lot of brands to consider this as a very practical and pragmatic approach. And I think there's another reason for this. I think Malaysia lends itself particularly to British brands, obviously because the Commonwealth connection. A lot of Malaysians study in the UK. There's a lot of crossover between the UK and Malaysia on many different levels. Nottingham University has a campus here. Heriot Watt has a campus here. Epsom College opened up recently. So the ties, historical ties, the sort of Commonwealth legacy heritage ties go back a long way. And I don't think it's surprising, therefore, that we do see so many brands already in the market have managed to sustain business here for a number of years. And over a great period of 10, 20 years, we've had the likes of M&S here, and ourselves over almost coming up to 10 years. So there's a lot of affiliation with British brands and everything British, and I think that it makes absolutely perfect sense for UK brands in particular to consider a market entry into the region in a place which is open to business for British companies and firms. And I think it's very important also, probably we'll get to this a bit later on, but to commend the likes of the work from the DIT and Fred's team and the the British High Commission, the British Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. All these institutions really do a great job of trying to promote that Britishness, if you will. And case in point was the great shopping campaign that was run very successfully here didn't do it this year, but for the past 3 years. And I think when it first started 3 or 4 years ago, there were about 40 brands that were involved, and it finished off last year, the final year they ran it, at well over 120, I think. So again, I think it shows that there's definitely a willingness to buy into the Britishness of brands that come to the market, assuming they've got a selling point. And then that is a completely different matter again. I mean, what is it you're selling? Is it the right price? Is it suitable for the market?
Thanks for that, Andy. And that's, I think, really sort of fundamental and interesting point about the need to be flexible in terms of the local market, but also sort of understanding what is the essence, I guess, of your brand. What is it you're bringing to the market that's suitably different? I mean, Lee, in terms of when you're evaluating and as you took the decision to expand internationally, was that in your mind about what is it you're exporting, really? And then also, as Andy's point about, but also that willingness to be flexible locally.
Most definitely, and I think you just need to be very careful that you don't take an arrogant approach, that you believe that you're bringing something that is completely unique, and that you're coming with a British brand and therefore it's definitely going to be successful. I think you certainly need, obviously, to understand the market that you're going into, but you also need to understand that degree of flexibility. And for us, for example, one of the fundamentals that we have is that our stores are much smaller internationally. That's partly to do with real estate costs, but it's also to do with allowing our partners the flexibility to deselect from the range. Coming back to Andy's point, don't want puffer jackets at this time of the year. They don't want heavy knitwear. But if you insist and you police to a certain size of store with a certain outlook, it makes it very, very difficult for the partner. So I think we, by allowing that smaller store, by allowing them very much to select the product, really buys them into the process. And that was quite a fundamental decision for us because, as you can imagine, there's a number of people in the business who are very passionate about the brand and the way that we position ourselves, and they needed to be bought into the process to understand that our windows aren't going to be the same, our advertising campaigns aren't going to be the same, the product proposition possibly isn't going to be the same, and you need all of those people on board to really then be able to sort of move forward with any authority.
Yeah. Andy, coming back to you, I wanted to sort of pick up also on this whole issue about this dynamic young population and the rise of e-commerce and mobile commerce. Just keen to get your views how that looks and feels on the ground, and is it driving what would be called an omnichannel model for Debenhams in Malaysia?
Undoubtedly, and there's no question. It was very good that the recent retail conference convention actually had such a focus on it. And Fred pointed out again, that huge 260 million Indonesians, and they've all got a phone. Well, most of them do, and Malaysia, I think, is one of the most connected countries in the world, as is Singapore, and so it's inescapable. You've got to have also a strategy, an omni-channel strategy that takes into account that you really need to be selling online in some capacity. I think what Devlins as a business are doing that very well. They started by, and I think it obviously also depends on the scale of the business you're talking about bringing to the region. I mean, obviously Devlins being a big company, they were able to set up a Far East distribution centre a few years ago, so the hub is now in Singapore. So building off that, they're now in a better position to actually be able to capitalise on online opportunities as they come about. And I think they launched recently, a few weeks ago actually, on the Zalora platform. So with a few brands, 9 by Savannah Miller, Henry Holland, I think Bendelisi Petit as well. That's just the way the nature of the business is going. But I think that being said, it's important for principals, because I come from a bricks and mortar perspective, to balance that necessity of having the product available to the greatest volume possible to everyone, with where they can potentially buy it, with the fact that we're the ones investing on the ground millions into their stores and the bricks and mortar operations. So, and I think that goes beyond pure lip service. I think they actually there needs to be a bit of trade-off in some form, whether it's slight commission or something. It just has to go hand in hand with your bigger strategy. Otherwise, frankly, what's the point down the line? Yes, there may be small figures now. People say a few percent here, 5% by the end of next year in terms of online sales, but that's going to grow. I mean, it's UK is 15, 20% on. So we're just going to see the same escalation here, there's bad news stories here. And coming back, Ian, to the question you asked originally about the economic situation, the situation as it stands, I think this all ties into this discussion, because it's just been announced today that John Little are shutting their final store in Singapore. We've seen the likes of Gap shut stores there over the last year or two. We've seen Larry's Farm close shop. We've seen New Look close shop. River Island failed. So it's a very challenging environment. And so, yes, we appreciate as partners the necessity of a principal to have an omni-channel business and to sell online. But I think that the brands that get it right will be the ones who actually do take a holistic approach and say, yes, we need that, but we can't allow our bricks and mortar partners to suffer as well. So how are we going to address that very difficult grey area of making sure that everyone benefits to some degree, and it's not just, yes, online's going to grow and grow and grow at the expense of a bricks and mortars operation. Yes, I take on board that retail, the physical environment has to become much more entertaining and much more of a destination for customers and act as a sort of flagship store. But fundamentally, if that's all it's ever going to be, and people then go out of the store and buy it online, there's no point people like ourselves signing up with any principal partner. So that's really I think the difficult bridge that's going to be increasingly needed to be crossed as the online business grows going forward.
Thanks, Andy.
I think the points Andy made are absolute paramount. Many companies, British companies that went into a number of markets globally 20 years ago, did not think through the power of the online situation, and contractually there was no provision made. And I think it's important that people realise that most of the millennials these days, and I was recently at a meeting with a group of millennials that were showing us how they shop, and many of those millennials don't do anything different than myself these days. They may spend more of their time online and on mobiles looking at product and buy more product, but they still like to have the experience, maybe at the end of each week or the end of the month, either they're taking goods back to a store, they're exchanging goods or whatever. They want to know that they're dealing with a trusted brand. And I see the online situation as almost advertising your business. And those companies that have a fantastic online strategy alongside a bricks and mortar strategy, I believe, will gain greater market share in all markets across the globe. So having the ability to have an omni strategy, I think, is absolutely vital. Yeah. And especially in markets such as ASEAN at the moment, because again in the UK, we know that online will probably grow in the next 5 years to about 25% of total retail business. But it will start to plateau. And there are many retailers here in the UK already coming up with quite inventive strategies on how they are pulling their customers through their online presence into their stores, and they're closing the sale in their stores. So, Andy, I'm with you, and I think any company coming into any market needs to do three basic things as far as I'm concerned. They have to make sure their research is absolutely spot on, that they don't just rush into the market without doing detailed research. Secondly, they've got to have resource, and that resource is both in terms of people and finance. They've got to make sure their package is right. And the third thing is they've got to have resolve, because you're not necessarily going to repatriate profits immediately, and it could take 2 to 3 years before you actually see repatriation of profits back to the UK.
Yeah. Come back onto this online point, how developed is the online side of your business, and do you, if it is, do you use it as a sort of lead into test markets?
Absolutely. I think for us, we're fortunate in a way as a British brand that we have come to the international party a little bit later. So we've been able to learn some of the lessons that maybe some of other brands have that launched with bricks and mortar in the 80s and 90s and are now looking back over their shoulder at how they actually manage the online. For us, in our partner selection, we've actually been quite careful to ensure that we've got partners who, at the appropriate time, can come on the online journey with us, and therefore can fulfil that omni-channel criteria. Yeah. For us, it's still developing some of the technology and the ability to be able to whether it's pricing, payment types, the way the page looks, the language, all of those things are things that are evolving for us. But we have struck deals, to be frank, with our partners that, coming back to Andy's point, share that online development. So at the moment we are purely shipping our goods to that international market, and although we don't have, for example, in the Middle East an online presence per se, any sales that are generated in their markets, and I say their markets, we've given them exclusivity, we share the commission with them, as they are our feet on the ground, they are our brand ambassadors, and for us, I guess we've been fortunate in that we can build some of that into our earlier infrastructure, whereas a number of UK brands are having to go back over themselves now and either try to extricate themselves from deals that they've done or work with partners that have got very, very established bricks and mortar businesses and actually see the online as a threat rather than an opportunity. And I think and the ASEAN region for us will be no different, yeah. In terms of how we take that approach.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I want to sort of move on to, we've talked about the retail opportunities and challenges from a retail perspective, but as a business perspective, looking at opening up new markets and taking your business to ASEAN region or anywhere, I want to sort of get your views on the kind of the business considerations, like what's the tax and customs considerations, the legal background that you have to do. I mean, obviously, I'm sure that DIT helps businesses and advises in that area. But I don't know, maybe Andy, if you could give us a flavour of sort of operating, or your advice to a UK business looking to set up the fundamentals, i.e., registering a business and the tax and all those sort of important aspects of setting up a business.
Again, my experience would purely be on Malaysia in that respect, yes. And it's not too tricky. Before, I think a number of years behind, but further back, it was more complex, and there were sort of ratios of foreign ownership, and you had to have far greater local involvement in businesses. I think that has relaxed a lot. I think the difficulties are more, to be honest with you, I hear that it is quite tough getting into Indonesia. There's a lot of changes. It's a bit like India in that regard. Perhaps there's a lot of chopping and changing, and no one's quite clear that everything's going to stay particularly the same one week to the next. So I think Malaysia is much more stable in that regard. Obviously, Singapore is one of the easiest countries in the world to do business in. I think it ranks number one in that regard virtually every year. So Singapore for sure is easy to get into, and the problem is the cost of doing business there is astronomical. And I think that again harks back to the issue that when Lee said maybe they're thinking of Malaysia first. I think Singapore actually is on the verge of technically a recession, in terms of the business environment there, if we're able to talk a little bit about that, I think there are serious concerns about the cost of doing business there, the cost of labour, the cost of the operational overheads. Yes, rents are starting to come down. I think landlords have finally, the sort of pennies dropped, and they're realising that they cannot sustain those sort of historically high levels. But it's not fast enough for a number of brands who are really struggling. So I still think that actually, in terms of our immediate area where we are here in Malaysia, Thailand on our northern border, Singapore on our southern border, I think actually Malaysia does make perfect sense. We have a number of serious socio-economic political problems ourselves here right now. I'm not going to kid anybody. You know, we have the mother of all corruption scandals right on our doorstep right now. It's been ongoing for the past year. I don't see any particular resolution to that issue probably until the next general election, which is scheduled for 2018. That depends on whether we actually have an election, because there's a lot of issues here which might actually impact on the current incumbent government actually not being able to hold it, short of a lot of people going to jail. So those issues aside, Malaysia, it sounds very scary, but this whole region has, you know, Thailand has historically lots of political problems, and yet retail still which manages to forge ahead. And I think if I was a British brand, I wouldn't be put off necessarily by reading too many of the stories that you do read about the political situations in any of the particular countries in this region. But be cognizant that the economy is not doing particularly well. It's not doing as well as it was 2 years ago. The drop in oil prices clearly had a massive impact on particularly in Malaysia, where there's been a huge emphasis on relying on petroleum and oil products. So all these things factored in, it's not a particularly rosy picture. That being said, I think there's opportunity and adversity. And I think in Malaysia, again, there's a glut of commercial retail space. So there really are very good opportunities to get good deals right now on the table. But you have to be careful that you get a good deal that actually, you know, there are shoppers who are still going to come to the mall in question and shop there. So that's the challenge. Yes, I think in Malaysia and Singapore there are better chances of getting deals now than there were 12 months ago even. But are the shoppers spending less? And the answer simply is they are not spending as much as they were. And tourism numbers have dropped, especially from mainland China, Indonesia, as well, into Singapore and KL. So there's a lot of these things that need to be, you know, just being borne in mind, that it's not just the land of milk and honey. There are issues, as there would be anywhere. But I don't think it's enough to scare people off or brands off from making that jump and considering getting involved in the market.
Thanks very much, Andy. So, Lee, your checklist when you're looking at a new market, I mean, you've heard what Andy was saying there. I mean, how high up the list of your checklist are those infrastructure issues and
I think
legal and tax and customs?
I think for us it starts really from the fact that we, as a business, are not necessarily looking to go and set up ourselves as a business in the country. So our model is still very much franchise. So that in itself puts more of the emphasis onto the local partner to be, you know, that's part of what they bring to the table, is that established business and an infrastructure that's already in place. But even despite that, I think we would go through a very simple red, amber, green checklist along the lines of economic, social, political criteria, and rank countries then based on that. But hey, you know, you're talking to someone who's got stores in Libya. So I think those criteria are obviously important and they will steer us in a certain direction. But come back to that point, but for us it's really about that local partner. And if you've got someone who's determined and driven and has got that local resource and influence, they can turn an average market into a very good market. And similarly, you can give a fantastic market to a not such strong partner and really struggle. So what we tend to do more is work with our partners on very basic P&Ls. So we would do exactly the same for any of the Malaysian and or other Asian businesses that we look at. And to be frank, you also need to be big enough to put your hands up and at a certain time say, do you know what, it's not quite for us at the moment. The duty structure, the tariff structure, the cost of goods into the country, it's not quite ready for us yet. Or we need to go away, sharpen our pencil and look at ways of making ourselves more attractive as well for the market. Yep. So there are lots of checks and balances that we do on that journey from identifying a market to actually launching. And I do think it is very important that you also have the resolve, as Fred has said, to stick with some of those challenges, but also be big enough just to say either we need to change and do things this way, or let's just take a deep breath and revisit in 3 or 6 months.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and we're actually sort of starting to come towards the end of our allotted time. It's been absolutely fascinating. You know, really appreciate the detail that you've shared with us. But to maybe wrap the discussion up and help summarise, I wonder if I can ask each of you just to, and Andy, in your last response, you did sort of give some very clear thoughts on the opportunities within the region. But I wonder if I could ask you just to sort of your concluding remarks. You know, to UK retailers perhaps looking at Asia and the ASEAN region in particular?
Yeah, I think, again, I hope I haven't scared people off. I think that if you're coming to the market, this whole idea of having a very clear thought out strategy, I think Lee, clearly his company have got one. I think that's their experiences in the Middle East will lend them getting involved here. It will be far easier. And that strategy, really, the bigger you are, the more scale you can bring to the region. If you're able to set up a Far East distribution centre, if you're able to talk about bringing in Australia and New Zealand into the equation, then I think Southeast Asia as a whole is a very, very attractive market in the short, medium and long term. I think British companies need to be involved in this region as opportunities in other regions like Europe may be drying up. I mean, just today, M&S, I think, was it announced they're closing 60-odd stores internationally. They're all wholly owned stores. Most of them are in Europe, Eastern Europe. Yeah. So I think the emphasis will then be, well, where are the other markets that we need to sort of address the balance with? I think Asia is the pivot. I think that's where everyone agrees that's where there's going to be more and more focus going forward. So I think you have to have an omni-channel. There's no getting away from it. You've got to have that approach when you come to the market. So how you're going to choose a partner. Again, Lee's actually spot on. It's got to be the right partner, but how are you going to work with that partner with an online presence? How's that online presence going to be formatted? I think you need to have the right product at the right price. I think the days clearly are long gone of the sort of luxury products in Hong Kong and Singapore. They're losing a lot of traction. I think the future for the medium term, certainly in this part of the world, is going to be basically more on mid-range, more affordable brands. So especially when you talk about, yes, there's 260 million people in Indonesia, but how many can afford a Gucci or a Coach bag? So I think that the markets that really have interest, or the market sounds interesting to get into, is that sort of mid-level market in particular. And I think probably that's about it from my side.
Thanks very much, Andy. Lee, if I can turn to you, what's your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think as far as the Asian region's concerned, I think for us it's almost a natural progression in terms of the way that our business is developing and internationally expanding. I think as well the market itself just can't be ignored. You can't, and I don't want to necessarily group it all of the countries because they do have their individuality. But if you're looking at the whole region, whatever statistic it is that you quote, whether it's 10% of the world's population, one of the biggest middle classes in the world, if you group it together, a very young demographic, I think as a UK retailer looking to develop internationally, as a minimum, it's certainly a region that you need to take a very hard look at. And certainly that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Yeah.
And last word to you, Fred, and the role of the Department for International Trade.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we sort of talk to companies about, because we have generally a very light touch when we're talking about companies like M&Co. Professionals, they know what they're doing. Debenhams, professionals, they know what they're doing. But we deal with an awful lot of companies that may be new to some of these markets as well. And one of the things that we talk about is having a broader view. So if they were stepping into the market, that they need to consider at very early stages. If let's say they go to Singapore first, which many British companies have done, Singapore, Malaysia, but if they are looking at stepping into the region, they need to think a little bit wider, and they need to think about basics like trademarks, because they may choose to step into Singapore. They may choose to step into Malaysia, and 2 years down the track, they come to step into Indonesia and find that somebody has registered their trademark in that country. It happens. We see it all the time. And therefore, one has to take a fairly broad perspective. If you're looking at a market, you have to realise that once your brand gets exposure, and that's what is important, you have a brand, and that brand needs to be protected. So we talk about due diligence to people. And one final note, I always go back to basics when I talk to companies. and what's going to make their model successful in the country. And the way I was taught it a long time ago by a very a man who knew much more about retail than me when I was a very young man. He said, you've got to have the right merchandise in the right place, at the right time, in the right quantity and at the right price. And he likened it to somebody called Gordon Selfridge. And supposedly that remark was known as the 5 rights of Gordon Selfridge. And you know what? It still stands true today, whichever market you're in.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. So that concludes our discussion on this fascinating but really important topic of the international opportunities for UK retailing, but looking specifically at the ASEAN region. Hopefully what you've heard with this discussion is obviously not without challenges, as with any market anywhere around the world. But equally there's some hugely exciting opportunities, and you know, UK retail has a well-deserved name right around the world for having created some of the very best retail businesses and best brands, because this is a hugely competitive market. So I think it's hardly surprising that UK retail can travel and can look at some really tough markets and survive, and also sees the opportunities for in many other emerging markets. So I'd like to thank our panellists. It's been a great discussion. So Fred from representing Department for International Trade, Lee from M&Co, and from Kuala Lumpur, Andy Jackson. Thank you very much for joining us. I should give a plug to the World Retail Congress, which DIT is supporting again, which will take place next year in Dubai in April the 4th to the 6th, 2017. And everything you've heard here will be sort of expanded on, because international expansion is a hugely important part of what we discuss at the World Retail Congress. But from a more immediate point of view, if anything you've heard is of interest or you'd like to find out more, then certainly contact Fred Bassnett and his team at the DIT. And above all, I hope you've enjoyed listening to the discussion. Thank you for watching, and once again, thank you to our panellists. Thank you.